Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Um, Today, we're going to talk about chapter 5 from the book Interplay. If you have it with you, it's always convenient for you to have it with you and have it out so that as we speak about the chapter, you can kind of follow along. I'll try to give you the pages as we start talking about the terms and ideas. I have the book out here, so sometimes I'll read off the definition straight from the book just so we have a better understanding. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. All right. So when we're talking about language, right? Some people use sort of think of language as sort of English, Spanish, and it's true. It is. English is a language, Spanish is a language, French is a language, and so forth and so on. But language could be so much more, right? It's the words that you use, the words that are used in a certain context and what they mean to you versus what they mean to somebody else. And so language plays a huge role in how we communicate with each other. Okay. So let's start off with the nature of language. Okay. And when we talk about the nature of language, the first thing we start off with is the idea that language is symbolic. Okay. Language is symbolic in that they're arbitrary symbols, right? In themselves. Certain words have things that mean something special. So when you look at a word like love or liberty or freedom, all those words, they mean something. They mean more than what the word is itself. There's a symbol. So somebody says love, there's a difference. There's a difference in what it means to you and what it symbolizes. And saying things like I love you versus I'm in love with you, and so forth and so on. And how I love to play basketball versus I love the Lakers versus I love to read, I love to go to class, or I love my wife, I love my kids, right? Love is a symbol. It means something. It stands for something. So that's the first thing. Second thing is language is rule governed. There's rules. There's certain things that you say and how you say it. And the reason that there's rules is so that we understand. There's a reason that a comma exists in a sentence so that we understand that this is a sentence, but this phrase is separate from that phrase. And so we won't get any miscommunication, right? So certain rules apply that make us understand how the language is used. Okay. The next thing is that language is subjective. In other words, the words can mean different things to different people, right? And so it's like saying the word hello versus hello. Each one of those things, each one of those words, and how it's used and the tone. There's a rule that identifies as to why you said it the way you said it, and in understanding those rules, if somebody else knows the same rules, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. Okay. And then the last thing is that language as a worldview. And when we talk about language as a worldview, is that, and here it talks about the linguistic relativity of language, is that language both reflects and shapes the worldview of those who use it. For instance, bilingual speakers seem to think differently when they change languages. In one study, French Americans were asked to interpret a series of pictures. When they spoke in French, their descriptions were far more romantic and emotional than when they used English to describe the same kind of message. And what that means is that when they started speaking in French, they sort of took on the culture of the French. And when they spoke English, they sort of took upon that culture of the English, especially with the words that are being used. So how you speak sometimes can sort of have an effect on how you act, right? And what language you use and what part of the world it reflects that same thing. Okay. Now let's talk about the impact of language. Now I'm on page 141 right now. Uh, when you're talking about the impact of language, you talk about a couple things, and here in this slide talks about naming and identity to begin with. Um, Most people don't always understand the impact that a name can have, right? What your name is called. I remember for my son Sebastian, who was our firstborn. my wife and I wanted to make sure that we gave him a strong name, right? What we thought was a strong name. It was a strong name. It was also had to be a name that could easily uh, uh, be spoken in English and in Spanish without having to change any of the letters that are in the name. So we came up with the word Sebastian, right? So in Spanish it's Sebastián. In English, it's Sebastian. So we didn't have to change anything. Like my name, Jaime. In English, it's a Spanish name, Jaime, but in English, it's either Jamie, Jim, or James. Well, you have to change the letters a little bit, or add an S, or do whatever. And we didn't want that. And we just thought to ourselves, like, Sebastian is a strong enough name that you could use it in both cultures. And so for us, it was important to have a name that identifies us. Okay, and that in turn identifies my son. The next thing is affiliation. The name that you use can affiliate you to a certain group, right? A lot of people sometimes look at Irish names, for example. Well, they have the O and then the apostrophe and then Connor, right? O'Connor, O'McCleary, right? And so a lot of times that O, a little apostrophe there, it sort of adds to a certain reference to maybe that culture, or maybe a certain name, if it's in Spanish, it reflects that culture. Um, it's important to sort of see that sometimes, you know um, Bartholomew the Third, right? When you put the third there, it kind of affiliates you to sort of a lineage of names of your predecessors. And so again, affiliation, your name can sort of identify who you belong to, right? The other one is power and politeness, right? The language that you use can sometimes dictate the language of politeness or the language of power, right? It's there's a difference between saying, "Hey, I need it done now," versus, "Hey, can you please do this quickly?" Right? When you say, "I need it done now," you're exerting authority and power versus, "Hey, can you please do this quickly? I really appreciate it." That's more polite. And not to say that one is different than the other. And if you're a parent, you kind of understand that sometimes you have to show a little bit of power because in order to get the kids to do what you want them to do, or if you're a manager at work or in some sort of authority position, sometimes you have to exude that power in order to make things happen. On the other side of it, it's never wrong to be polite. It's never wrong to show respect, and sometimes politeness in using the language can tell you that. So, power and politeness is important when it comes to the language you use. And then obviously you get into sexism and racism when you get into ideas and words that really are demeaning in many cases. For example, and I fall into this because I grew up using this word quite often, especially affiliated with sports, is using the term guys. Hey, what's up, guys? How's everybody doing? Right? And so a lot of times what happens is that you walk into a classroom and an instructor will say, "Hey, what's up, guys?" And everybody will say hello, right? But if I were to walk in and say, "Hey, gals," some of the males in the class may say, "Hey, what gals? No, no, guy." Well, why is it okay that when I say guys, it's all encompassing, but when I say gals, then it really separates, right? And the idea here is if we're going to use gals for, to identify a certain group, then we should use guys to identify a certain group and not automatically use guys as something that's all encompassing. So I tend to use terms like, "Hey team, how's everybody doing?" Right? Terms that are more sort of indicative of who we are and how we identify. And you could see sort of terms like that being used that could be considered racist and that fall into racism as a whole. The next thing we have is precision and vagueness. Okay. And when we're talking about precision and vagueness, we're talking about how you use that language and whether you're trying to be vague or you're trying to be specific to what you're trying to say, right? So the first thing when you talk about ambiguous language consists of words and phrases that have more than one commonly accepted definition. Um, so when you're talking about ambiguous language, it's like saying, "Man, they were really fighting out there." Well, does that mean that they were arguing, or does that mean that they actually had a physical fight, right? And so the idea there is that that language, the use of the word fight, could be very, very vague depending on how you use it, who's involved, and whatnot. Then you have words that are very abstract. So we're talking about abstraction. And we're talking about abstractions. Abstractions are convenient ways of generalizing about similarities between several objects, people, ideas, or events. That's according on page 149, right? So when you look at figure 5.3, what you have there is sort of an abstract ladder. And at the very top, it's more abstract. You know, the idea is more out there, right? And at the very top of that ladder, it says you need to have a better attitude. Well, somebody says you need to have a better attitude. What does that mean? Um, it means I need to be kinder. I need to be more open. I need to be happy. I don't understand, right? It's too vague, too abstract, right? Whereas if you want to be really specific, you say you need to quit complaining every time we have to work late or come in on weekends. Oh, all right. Then that does refer to have a better attitude in regards to complaining about having to work late or on weekends. All right, that is more specific. So abstract is when it's really out there and really leaves it open for interpretation. Okay. Next, we have a euphemism, and when we're talking about euphemism, it's it avoids direct literal reference to an event such as she died, substituting terms to describe it like she's no longer with us. So when you're talking about a euphemism, think about the idea of how you would speak to a child so as to not make the child cry, for example, right? So if somebody passed away, if somebody's mom or dad passed away, the example that it used here, you're not going to tell a child, oh, he died, he's gone, right? That's very cold, right? And so a euphemism is something that sort of softens the blow and sort of makes it easier for in this case, the child to sort of take in. So, oh, you know what? He's no longer with us. He's up in heaven with God. All right, well, that's a euphemism, right? And so that's an example of how someone might take a very harsh or direct um, idea and really soften the blow by using a language and words that are a little bit nicer and kinder to do that. The next thing we have is relative language, which gains meaning by comparison. For example, do you attend a large or a small school? Okay, so if I was to say, do you attend a large or a small school? You might say, oh, mine's is large. Oh, mine's is small. Well, compared to what? Compared to who? So if I were to tell you, hey, is your college a big college? You might say yes. In comparison to what? Or you might say no. Well, in comparison to what? So it's a matter of, it's like when they say it's all relative. It is. It's relative. It's relative to what? You have to have sort of a base that you're going to compare that to. So, you might say, oh, this college is small compared to a university, or you might say this college is big compared to community colleges. So it just kind of depends. Okay. The next thing we have is static evaluation. And when you're talking about sort of evaluative language, um, it's it seems to describe something, but really announce the speaker's attitude towards it, right? So so for example, let in the examples that it has here, and it's called evaluative language here. It, it, it um, Imagine the idea that someone who really minds their money, right? Someone who's really careful about what they spend and how they spend it. So would you say that that person is thrifty, or would you say that that person is cheap, right? And what happens here is by using the word thrifty, you're sort of giving an approval. You're all saying, yeah, yeah, no, he's thrifty. He's well aware of his funds, and yeah. Whereas someone says, oh, that person's cheap. Well, cheap right there, the way it's used, sort of has a negative connotation to it. So, a lot of times the words you use can sort of tell people what your feelings are towards that. Okay. The next thing we have is called the language of responsibility. And here we are on page 152. So in the language of responsibility, you have what's called it statements, but statements, and I, you, and we statements. And when you're talking about I, you, and we statements, you're talking about the idea of who's responsible and who's taking responsibility for something that occurred, right? So let's just think of, let's just think of a situation where maybe you had trouble with a class, right? So it was a really hard class. You didn't do well, right? And so what happened there? Well, it was a hard class. That's why I didn't get an A. It was a hard class. So it's not your fault, it's the class's fault, because if the class wasn't so hard, you wouldn't get an A. So it's sort of giving responsibility to the class, which it might have been. There are several classes on campus that people find really difficult depending on a lot of situations, right? Then you have but statements, right? And the but statements is sort of giving you that excuse. Yeah, I didn't get an A, but a B is really good for me, so I'm happy with it, right? So that but statement really gives you an out. It gives you an excuse, right? And then what you have here is the I, you, and we statement, right? I did that. I made it happen. It was my fault, right? Or versus it was your fault. You did it, right? Versus we did it, right? We didn't do well. So think of a situation here where you may have been involved in a group project, right? Now, as a group, you get a grade. And let's just say that you didn't do well on that grade because one of your team members just didn't put in the time, didn't put in the effort, and it faltered, and it really caused you to have a bad grade as a team. And then that person will come up and say, yeah, we didn't do very well. Well, you might look at it and say, well, yeah, we didn't get grade, but you didn't do well. We did great, but because of you, our grade came down. So that person is sort of deflecting responsibility by saying we, and you're coming back saying, no, you, right? Okay. Um, then you have what's called gender language. And in gender language, let's go back here. Um, you're talking about, and I think we talked about it a little bit earlier when we started talking about terms like guys and gals. Um, we use sort of terms and ideas to differentiate between genders, right? Um, and a lot of times, and in this book here, it uses the terms feminine and masculine to sort of differentiate here. And if you look at table 5.3, it gives you the idea that feminine communication, they tend to converse to maintain relationships, they create climate of equality, and they offer an emotional support, to name a few. In the masculine language, they converse to take control, and they create a sense of power and status, and they solve tasks and problems. So you can see how the masculine tends to be more involved in the sort of the I'm in charge sort of role, versus the feminine tends to be a more like, hey, let's get this done together if we can, right? There's a little difference there in the way that language is used. Now there are some significant differences. When you see something, a book, for example, that's called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, it sort of puts the idea here that men and women um, are different, that they use language in a different way to get their points across. Um, here, um, it states social scientists have acknowledged that there are some significant differences in the way men and women behave socially. These findings have led some scholars to describe males and females as members of distinct cultures where their differences are arising primarily from socialization rather than biology. So you can kind of see the difference. And if you don't really like see that, you can kind of, if you have an opportunity to sort of talk to an older couple, look at the difference between the way, let's say, your mom talks versus the way your dad talks, or the way they speak, right? You could kind of see the differences there, right? When you approach them, how are they taking in the information, and how are they responding back? That really says a lot about their differences in their gender. There's also some minor differences. Um, some of the minor differences sort of say that researchers asked men and women to describe health-related episode in their lives. Analysis of the transcripts revealed that women used slightly more intense adverbs and personal pronouns than men did. However, participants who read the transcripts were largely unable to identify the speaker's gender. The same researchers then asked men and women and transgender women to describe painting. Studied closely, the transgender women's words choices were slightly more similar to men's than women's, but again, Most people could not distinguish between them on the basis of word choice. And what it's telling you there is that sometimes, yeah, there may be some minor differences. Let's just say that someone responded to you in writing, right? And you asked a group of students a bunch of questions, and then they gave you responses in writing. Would you be, not knowing who wrote it, would you be able to tell who were feminine and who were masculine? And in the book it says, yeah, you might. There might be some very minor differences, but not as much as you might think. And what that's telling you is that a lot of times it's not the words themselves that are different, but how those words are used, pronounced, articulated, and in what context. Okay? So kind of keep that in mind. Now, in accounting for sort of gender differences, you want to be aware of certain scenarios because again, there's a really big cross section as to how people identify themselves. And just because you speak in one way doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way they are all the time. Nor is it sort of a broad brush where that's they speak. Not only do they speak like that all the time, that's just it identifies who they are. For example, you may have a mom who is very caring and nurturing at home when it comes to their kids, but when at work, they're very powerful and very boisterous in the words that they use. You have two different ways of speaking, different contexts. So sometimes you have to kind of like account for those differences. Okay. And then the next thing we have is sort of social media and language. And this really comes out to the idea of understanding online language and impression management. What are the words that you're using online? And here, we're not necessarily, even though this is online and you're going to be able to hear my voice and sort of see my picture, which really lends itself to you understanding the words that I use, the context that I'm using, and so forth and so on. But think of situations where, like, maybe you're on some sort of social media, whether it be Instagram, Facebook, or something similar, and the words that you use and how you use them, how you emphasize certain emotions. It's interesting to note the word choices that people use in social media to really emphasize how they use them. Not to mention all the other things that you see, kind of like emoticons. I mean, just think of a message. Think of a message in your head. Okay, just a simple message, whether "Hey, how are you?" or "Fine, thank you." Just something simple that someone might text you, and then imagine that in all caps. Does that change the message? It probably does. Why? Because in social media, maybe capitalizing everything sends a different message. The question is why, right? Is it just an understanding? What if I'm visually impaired and having the larger caps helps me read it? Well, that's something to consider. So it's an impression to understand the language and the impression management that happens when you use certain words in certain situations in a social media setting. And then understanding the language and how it identifies you as your gender, or is there an identification of gender based on the language that you use? Okay.